Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Michael Shermer here, your host for the Science Salon, our last of the season until we start up again in the fall. And so first order, thank you to the natives for letting us use their beautiful home here and spectacular views. So stay in tune with us through Skeptic, which is our free weekly electronic magazine on Wednesdays. And of course, we're always happy if you're subscribed to Skeptic magazine. We're still in print. We're one of the few still hanging in there. More than 50% of our subscriptions are from print, actually in real bookstores. So I don't think the book is dead. I don't think magazines are dead. So I think we're, yay. I know, see, old school. And we also, Walter, have a wine sponsor, Michael McCarran, who's here with his father. Welcome. And Michael has a company that engraves wine bottles for corporations, big gigs, and little orgs like ours. And so this is an actual physical 3D, and that's your book cover. So congratulations. And you can take that home and drink it, or drink it tonight if you don't want to carry it on the plane.
That's right, I'll drink it.
That's a really good wine. And it is good wine, yes, it's an actual, yes, so Carol Tavers here, our previous guest from a few months ago, she got her bottle of wine. Did you drink it already?
It says mistakes were made on it, but the wine was
not a mistake, right. And congratulations to Carol, by the way. She has the cover story this week in Times Literary Supplement. It's the end of gender or something like that. It's always one of those great titles for a cover. The end of, and then you fill in the
question mark.
And so finally, after 50 years of feminist studies, it's all been solved this week by Carol. Anyway, so... Anyway, welcome everybody. Come on in as we just get started here. Our guest today is Dr. Walter Scheidel. He's a professor of history at Stanford University. Thank you. Where he teaches ancient history, and his main interests are ancient social and economic history, pre-modern historical demography, and comparative and transdisciplinary approaches to world history. He obtained his degrees at the University of Vienna, and then after that, well, it says, according to your Wikipedia page, you completed your habilitation at the University of Graz. Right. So not rehabilitation,
nope.
So that's good. I don't think I've ever seen the word habilitation used. So what does that mean?
It's a degree past a PhD, because the Germans are very careful. So a PhD isn't quite enough to prove that
I see.
the field, so you have to do another.
So it's like a postdoc
That's
here,
right.
Something like that. All right. So... So most of his work is very specific cases of areas in the ancient Roman world and so on. And so his new book is The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to Last Week, basically. And so, of course, you had to pick the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse for a cover. It's a great cover. And it's a great read. It's really dense with data. And I guess by way of background, I've just kind of self-trained in economics. I never had any college courses, but I've taken all the teaching company courses in economics, and I've been reading economics books for decades. Not that I'm that interested in it, but I really think it's probably one of the most important subjects to understand how the world really works. And I don't remember seeing the subject of income inequality for all these decades until the meltdown, really until like 08, 09, when all of a sudden it became an interest of subjects to everyone, a topic of interest to everyone, including economists. So is that what kind of triggered your thinking about maybe addressing this, what has become an important topic from your more specific research?
That's true. I'd long been interested in issues of income and wealth inequality, but in past societies. And it was only really about, as you say, 10 years ago when I encountered especially Piketty's work, before his big book came out, his early articles, and Emmanuel Saez's work, his collaborators, that I got the idea, well, maybe there is a template, there's a model here that can be applied to history more generally. And particularly look at 200 years, which for an economist, that's a really long period of time, right? But I'm used to working on material that comes from several thousand years ago. And so I thought, well, maybe it is possible to, if you survey the full run of human history, to find some patterns that repeat themselves over time. And that hunch, that intuition turned out to be true.
Yep. So it is an important topic. I want to open, we're talking about income inequality or wealth inequality, not other forms of inequality which are dealt with by other social scientists, but just the opening is striking. How many billionaires does it take to match the net worth of half of the world's population? In 2015, the richest 62 persons on the planet owned as much private net wealth as the poorer half of humanity, more than 3.5 billion people. If they decided to go on a field trip together, they would comfortably fit into a large coach. The previous year, 85 billionaires, so from 62 to 85, were needed to clear that threshold, calling for perhaps a double-decker bus. And not long ago, in 2010, no fewer than 388 of them had to pool their resources to offset the assets of the global other half. So they'd fill up an Airbus A340. And now you were just telling me it's down to like 8 or
That's down to 8. I mean, that doesn't really speak in favor of printed books, right? If this was electronic, I could probably fix it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you're
Fix
right.
the first paragraph.
Yeah, this is already, your opening sentence is out of date.
Yeah,
So eight people. So we would know them. We would know who
would
the
know
8
them,
are.
yeah.
I mean, it's probably Gates and Buffett and
Zuckerberg
Slim
and the Google founders. And,
Yeah,
Slim.
right. Okay, so the first question is so what?
That's true. Well, that's a very strange kind of development. And to some extent, if you just look at global wealth inequality, it's very much a function of differences in development. So there are plenty of countries out there with lots of people in them that are just not as developed as the United States or other Western countries. So to some extent, it's just a function of that. But if you look at, say, countries, you find a similar trend. The concentration isn't as high within the US, but we're certainly trending in that direction. And there you can no longer just say, well, that's just a function of what happened or didn't happen 100 or 200 years ago in terms of early industrialization. It's really a much more recent change. And that's something that we, at the very least, need to think hard about. It may not be the end of the world, but it's certainly something taking a closer look at.
Yeah, so your cover on the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, it's not income inequality that's going to bring about the end of the world. It's these wars and plagues and so on that curtail income inequality, but only for a limited period of time. So before we get into that, though, what are we talking about with income, my monthly salary? Are we talking about investments, homes, cars? Are we talking about retirement accounts, wealth? How do economists and historians think about when you say somebody's wealth or their net worth or their income? These are slightly different things.
They are certainly different things. And if you look at modern societies, there are ever so many ways of defining what income means. You have wage inequality, capital income inequality, overall income inequality, any number of things. And of course, people have hidden income that's hidden in offshore accounts and that sort of thing. So it's actually very difficult to pin down. Now, if you try to do what I try to do, which is look at the very, very long term, you don't really have the luxury of worrying too much about what specific type of inequality you're looking at. For the most part, we're really looking at wealth inequality because before the 20th century, it was much easier to assess or estimate people's wealth in order to tax it accordingly. Income inequality is something you can really only properly measure in most cases in the 20th century, for as long as there have been income taxes, and income taxes are a fairly recent phenomenon, and that really generated the statistics that now make it possible to make these observations.
So it's this Gini index that everyone uses now, of two kinds. So maybe you can deconstruct that. Probably most of us have heard of it, but some kind of a measure between one. Bill Gates owns the entire world, right. And 0, everyone has the same amount of money.
That's right. I mean, the Gini index is a single figure that measures the overall degree of inequality within a given society, a given group of people. Ideally, if every single member of a given group earns the same or owns the same amount of resources, the Gini coefficient would be 0. And if one person has all the income or all the wealth, the Gini coefficient would be 1. And of course, in real life, neither one of these scenarios ever applies. It has to be somewhere in between. So the higher the Gini is, the more unequal a society is, the lower it is, the more evenly resources are distributed. And so in theory, you could have a wealth inequality Gini of 1. It is theoretically possible for one person to literally own everything. It's not possible for one person to have all the income because everybody else, at the very least, has to eat enough to survive, right? So there is a certain a maximum ceiling to income inequality, but not necessarily to wealth inequality. What we see is that wealth inequality in the US is much, much higher than income inequality. The Gini is about twice as high for wealth than for income.
I think you said ours is currently at 0.47.
The income one is around 0.4, depending on how you measure, and the wealth one is more like 0.8 and change, because it can be really, really very high.
So wealth there is what you own and all your investments and
what you own. And I should say the statistic you said at the beginning that looks at people's net worth. So you have to subtract debt, mortgages, any number of obligations that people have. And that, again, advantages the very rich for whom these issues are not really very serious.
But I mean, if you owned, say, a $2 million home, but your mortgage was $1.6 million, you don't own a $2 million home.
No, that's right. You have to subtract whatever you owe the bank.
So they do that calculation.
They do that,
with it.
yes.
Okay, right.
Otherwise, the number wouldn't be 8 people. It would be probably a few thousand people.
Right.
It wouldn't really make a huge difference because there's 7.5 billion people on the planet. It would just look a little less extreme.
Right. And so the two Gini indexes are income and then just wealth.
That's right.
Right.
I mean, the other indexes really are the share of all income or all wealth that is captured by, let's say, the richest or highest earnings, 1%. And in a way, that's a more that's an index that tells you more, because the Gini is just a figure. And it's very difficult to relate to what it actually means in practice. But if you say the highest earning 1% American households earn 20% of all national income in the US, that's a very graphic kind of example that really gives you an idea of what's going on and how that relates to the income of the bottom half, let's say, of the distribution.
So before we get into what kind of problems that could cause, such as buying elections or influencing elections and things like that, let's go back into time, since that's your specialty, but all the way back to hunter-gatherers. So they had no income inequality because they had no income. And essentially they're, well, mostly egalitarian. There's taboos on about accumulating too much stuff, a lot of emphasis on food sharing, so that things get spread around fairly equitably so that no one suffers too much. And so that's our evolved psychology of what feels right. And then the modern world is so different from that, which is, I think, probably why we have a sense, for whatever reason, even if you can't articulate why it's bad, it just feels wrong.
That's true, but even foraging societies, and there are some left in the world today, we see that people have to work hard to really maintain an egalitarian distribution of whatever resources are available in this context, which tend to be quite modest. That has to be actively policed. So even in these societies that generate very little surplus, people are always trying to have a little more than the other guy and hide whatever animal they just caught and that sort of thing, and eat it themselves or share it just with the family and not with other members of the group. But it's much easier to police these things if you have a group the size of the number of people in this room and they all know each other. And it's very difficult to conceal whatever windfall you may enjoy.
So by human nature, we tend to want to be a little greedy, as much as you can get away with that without being punished.
That's probably true, and that's very deeply rooted, I guess, in our evolutionary psychology, because it is about reproductive success, competition for scarce resources, and that feeds into this desire that, if possible, if you can get away with it, to have more than others, to really get a leg up.
And so real wealth inequality or income inequality doesn't begin until you start producing stuff. So this really begins with the earliest state societies.
It starts remarkably with climate change, right? We're now in the habit of blaming climate change proactively for all kinds of things. It's really at the beginning of the Holocene, at the end of the last ice age. People settled down for the first time, farmed the land, herd livestock, settle down, develop institutions that allow people to accumulate wealth, claim it's their own, they own it individually or as a family, and especially norms to pass these assets on to the next generation. And if you do this long enough, even if you start out from a completely egalitarian base, over time you're going to have significant inequality. And then on top of that, that's reinforced by political processes, by state formation as people scale up into ever larger units. Well, they're really engines of this equalization. The rich and powerful are either the same people who run the show politically and militarily, or they're closely allied with them. And so the state comes to reinforce this type of economic inequality. And it hasn't totally changed in a way, even in the world we live in today.
And so as an ancient historian, or historian of the ancient world.
It's an important distinction.
When you say, well, okay, this is how much somebody in the Roman Empire made, or how do you know? How do we know?
The Roman Empire is a good example because we have a sufficient amount of textual references that allow us to really pin down how, for instance, the concentration of wealth at the very top of society evolved. We have a rough idea of how many people were ruled by the Romans, the size of the Roman economy, and we have quite some information about the size of the largest private fortunes, the Bill Gateses of the Roman world. And we can see that the size of these largest fortunes increases much more rapidly than the total number of people under Roman rule. So the rich clearly gained disproportionately from being at the very top of the food chain in these expanding polities. We have rich archaeological evidence. It's really quite striking. I had actually a PhD student who did a dissertation on this, showing that if you look at house sizes in different provinces of the Roman Empire, before and after Roman rule, people tended to be pretty poor, but evenly poor. There isn't a great spread in terms of how big or how small your house is. And during the Roman period, all of a sudden, there are these McMansions out there. There's a small group of people who are much richer than everybody else as a result of being incorporated into a large tributary empire. And when the empire goes away, everything goes back to a much more compressed distribution. So there are many, many different types of sources that allow us to actually say something meaningful about a society that existed 2,000 years ago.
And are there like a paper trail of records of how they earned this their money and how they became richer than the average?
It's certainly a mixture. It's a model that's probably closer to what we find in many developing countries today, or dare I say the People's Republic of China. There's a mix of market activity, of investment in land, in particular commerce, money lending, but also predatory behavior, alliances with the political power holders, bribery, extortion, and a number of ultimately violent, predatory ways of making a profit. And it's really the overall wealth is the sum total of these different income sources.
So one of my favorite sentences from your book is, the more that personal fortunes depended on access to political rents, the more income from labor, at least if we can define corruption, embezzlement, extortion, military plunder, vying for benefactions, and taking over the assets of rivals as forms of labor. So I presume this goes all the way back to the very beginning. I mean, there's always corruption and these sorts of things that were going on.
That's very true. I mean, economists would think of labor as we think of labor, right? You have a job or a business, but that's not really what labor is all about. I mean, this is certainly part of labor. It's hard work, right? To go out and rob other people blind. It can be dangerous, right? There can be backlash. It's risky, but that's work that many successful people in the past engage in, and with the results we see in terms of.
So in the Roman Empire, how did you purchase a piece of land? Who would you buy it from, and then you rent it out to people for farming or whatever, and then you get rents from that, and then you start to accumulate wealth? How does that begin?
Well, the Romans are famous for having property rights. I mean, many European countries, really, their legal tradition is rooted in the Roman tradition. So there's a market for land, there are contracts, transactions, just the way we do. So you can do it that way, sort of the modern way, if you will, right? You have title to land, you have a tenant, you have workers who farm the land for you. You may have slaves, but again, this was the case even in this country till 150 years ago. It's all covered by the law. And that's something we would recognize as being quite familiar. And of course, if you're lucky or patient or smart enough, you can certainly make a profit this way. But then there are alternative ways, right? You can lean on other people to get a better deal, or somehow appropriating their land. If they're in debt, you can buy them out. And if you are a member of the Roman ruling class, well, there's always the option of really going out and hitting other people over the head, incorporating them into the Roman Empire, enslaving them, taking away their stuff, and calling it your own. And for the people at the very top, for hundreds of years, it was really a mixture of both. And if you have both of these sources coming together, converging, they can really make the ruling class very rich indeed. And that's exactly what we see in the record. And it's not just the Romans, that's a standard pattern for 98% of states in history.
See, and it's that aspect of it, I think, that people resent, or they feel like there's something wrong with that. And one of my favorite videos that I show is from Franz de Waal's lab at Emory University with the two capuchin monkeys. Have you seen this, where they train them to exchange pebbles for food? So they learn the basics of money. And so if you change one pebble, you get a cucumber, slice of cucumber. Mm-hmm. The other one, you get a grape. And they like grapes more than cucumbers. Anyway, so in the setup, these two capuchins are in these translucent cages, and one gives his pebble and he gets a cucumber and he eats it and he's happy. And then the other one gives a pebble and he gets a grape. And he really likes that. And the first one sees this and he's very excited. He's like, oh boy, I'm going to get my grape. And he gives his pebble and the experimenter gives a cucumber and it's like, what? And you see him and he throws it at the experimenter and he's slapping the cage, rattling the walls. I mean, he's pissed. And so to me, it's, we deviate from them, 35 million years from these small brains. They clearly have a sense of right and wrong. And this seems to me the psychology of it. It's like I gave the same amount as he did, and I saw it, and I got less, and that feels wrong. And so that actually seems reasonable. That if what you're describing, happened, and we know it did, well, then naturally people are resentful.
Well, there's one big difference between the monkeys and us, which is the monkeys aren't socialized the same way. They aren't told from day one, I'm a member of, the peasantry, and this guy is a member of the lordly class. And so it's okay for them to have more than we do because that's the way God wants it, or it has always been like this, and so on. And once you internalize this, I think the experiment would run quite differently.
Yeah. Yeah, in other words, so one of these peasants say, if we went there in a time machine and said, are you looking forward to buying your own castle one day? He'd probably look at you like, what are you talking about?
That's not for me to do. And if you actually look at the ideology, the belief systems of many of the traditional societies, you have a very strong sense of a natural hierarchy, that some people deserve to be better off a priori because that's just the way it is. And the more you buy into this, and of course not everybody buys into this at the time, but people are probably more likely to buy into this because they lack different perspectives, mass education, a more democratic sense of how things maybe ought to be.
So this idea we have, like anybody can make it. If you work hard and you're honest and all that, that's pretty new.
That seems both very old in a way. A forager would have said, sure, if I'm a good hunter, a good gatherer, I'll be successful. That's the way it should be. But in between, we have thousands of years of agrarian societies where these hierarchies, these inequalities are very, very deeply ingrained. And so what we see in the more recent past, the last few generations, is in that sense new, but it's also returned to the way people used to think a very long time ago.
Yeah. So in looking at your list of countries and their Gini indexes, I mean, even a lot of the ones that have a low Gini index, a lot of these African countries, or these don't look like places I'd want to live. So maybe some forms of redistribution are not so appealing, and others where there's vast inequalities, it also looks like a lot of it's due to corruption. I mean, there's just so much corruption. I don't even know where to begin to ask, what do we do?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a difference between a rich country that has a great deal of inequality and a poorer country, because it then affects levels of poverty, right? It is possible to be in a rich country where poverty is greatly attenuated, but not many people are likely to starve, let's say, and yet you have a great deal of inequality. If you're in a poor country that's poor on average, high inequality necessarily means a great many people are going to be terribly destitute. And that's a much more serious problem than inequality per se. So you could compare the US to developing countries with a similar degree of inequality, but it means different things, especially for the people at the bottom of the income distribution.
Yeah, so for our Gini index for income, we are at a 0.4. So we're in Germany and Japan, 0.3 or so, or these Northern European countries that we think of as, socially progressive and fairly egalitarian. They're also about that 0.3 or so. And that kind of feels like, that seems like the right number. But I'm not even sure that's the right way to say it. I mean, to even ask, what's the right Gini number?
That's a very good question. It depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about people's perceptions, and I want to drag in our president because he gets mentioned way too often anyway, but I like the analogy when he said, make America great again. One of the reference points is really, I think, the post-war period, like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where things were a certain way. You could have strong economic growth, expanding middle class, and low inequality at the same time. And so in terms of when you ask what feels right, people would say that felt right because it's a very favorable combination of circumstances. And once that feels right, and conditions may no longer make it easy to get to that point or support this particular combination, well, it doesn't feel right. Now, economists would have a different answer. They would say, well, I mean, an economy could actually support a pretty high level of inequality before it has negative effects on economic growth, which is what economists, of course, care about. If you talk to other people who are more interested in social justice, they would say, well, it has to be a much lower level because otherwise it's unethical, it's unfair. Political scientists might say, well, at some point it becomes politically destabilizing. So it very much depends on where you are coming from, what your reference point is in this case.
But I mean, politically destabilizing, I mean, it almost sounds like, well, we want to keep things equal so the masses don't rise up and overthrow the society. I mean, there's got to be a better argument for why we should have more equitable societies than that.
That's, again, like I said, if you're very hard-nosed and you only care about economic growth, you just measure at what point economic inequality is going to be bad for the economy. And if that's what you really care about, well, this is where you should take active measures. But those levels could actually could be pretty high. And again, if you just subscribe to more common notions of fairness. What is fair? How much should someone get who is in a specific kind of job, a job creator, whatever you want to call it? That's highly subjective in a way, right? It's very difficult to pin down. It will mean different things to different people. So it's very difficult to get to some kind of consensus in that respect.
I mean, like my favorite analogy is, let's say I make $100,000 a year and Elon Musk makes $100 million a year. And in the course of 5 years or so, our salaries double. Now, I'm pretty happy with my $200,000, but then when I look at Elon, I think, wait a minute, his slice of the pie is so much larger, and it just feels wrong. Now, I was telling this to a friend of mine who said, well, Shermer, you didn't invent PayPal and Tesla, and too bad. Well, okay, so, so again, there's that sense of, well, he did it fairly, and that's just the way the system is, and presumably not through corruption and graft and so on. But that's a huge inequality. I mean, it's just a gigantic difference. It's
a huge inequality. People used to complain in the 19th century many fortunes were inherited, right? And you could say, well, that's even less fair in a way, because people didn't do anything except for being born into the right family, which is not exactly a personal accomplishment. So if that's your point of comparison, you could say, well, people like Zuckerberg et al., I mean, maybe they deserve it more in a way. But again, once you look at the actual scale of disparities, they are much larger than they used to be, even in this country just a couple of generations ago. If you look at the richest people in the post-war period, their private fortunes were not nearly as large relative to the average possessions of the average Americans than they are now. So in that respect, we're sort of back to the Gilded Age. We have these Rockefeller types who really tower above everybody else.
Yeah, and relatively speaking, back to the Gilded Age, and just before 1914, I think, is your key year where you said it was, sort of maximum compared to where it is now. And so it was the Depression, the First World War, the Depression, the Second World War that leveled things out.
That's
for
true.
A while.
And that's really the key observation. If you do look at thousands of years of history, for something like 90+% of the time, inequality would either trend up slowly or be relatively stable at pretty elevated levels. And there were only a few occasions where it would actually go down significantly. And that was almost invariably driven by some massive violent shock, some kind of dislocation that disturbed, that upended the established order.
So you're big, let's get into just if you could get into the core of the book, the sort of the Four Horsemen. A war, plagues like the Black Death, state failures, revolutions. But what was interesting was that it's only a temporary leveling. I mean, things come roaring back pretty quick since World War II, say, less than half a century before the inequalities returned to where they were in 1914.
That's true. And you could say generally things accelerate, right, over time. Everything happens faster now than it would 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. So if you look at the earlier episodes, it takes a fair amount of time for the leveling to occur and quite a long time for conditions to return to the previous level. Now everything is much faster. Leveling in the 30s and 40s would just span just a few years in some cases, and then become stabilized for maybe a generation or so. And then inequality would start rising again. So we see that these cycles, if you view them as cyclical developments, that they have become progressed, that everything happens more rapidly than it used to.
What's the mechanism of, say, a plague or a mass war to level things out? It's just the rich people are dead? The state confiscates their estates?
Well, the mechanisms vary. They have two things in common, right? The Four Horsemen, all of them are violent, often on a really appalling scale, and they all reliably greatly reduce income and wealth inequality. But the actual mechanisms vary. So the most traditional type is really state collapse, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier when we talked about the Romans. If you have state structures that favor the rich, the inverse is also true. If governments, if states collapse, if these structures are dismantled, the rich simply have more to lose. Everybody may suffer, but if you live at subsistence level, you can't lose very much before you starve to death, and then you're no longer part of the population. It sounds very callous, but it's really true. Whereas if you're very rich, you can lose 99% of your property and still be around. And so that will really compress the gap between rich and poor because the rich become just far less rich. Once you have a plague, if you think of the Black Death in the late Middle Ages, what happens is the plague kills so many people that there's a scarcity of labor. It increases demand for labor, real incomes go up. At the same time, the value of land and other forms of fixed assets goes down. So in this case, it's the rich who are less rich, but the poor are less poor. That's a more beneficial outcome. Again, it's a pretty horrible thing because millions of people have to die, but at least among the survivors, the poor are temporarily considerably less poor in some cases. And we can see this in the record. And it lasts for as long as the plague is around. And when the plague subsides, the population grows back, you have more workers, the same amount of land, and then the gap opens again. You can track this quite neatly, even with late medieval and early modern statistics. So those are the two pre-modern leveling forces that have been largely replaced, it seems, in the 20th century by the other two you mentioned, mass mobilization warfare and what I call transformative revolution. And they're very, very closely tied together. I'm talking about World War I, World War II, and the major communist revolutions, Lenin, Mao, that are a direct result of the two world wars. And again, the mechanisms vary. If you just look at communism, it's pretty straightforward, right? You have communists who expropriate the rich, kill them often in the process, collectivize everything, so there's no longer any private wealth disparity because there's hardly any private wealth. There's a planned economy where the government sets all wages and prices, so the people at the top decide how much income inequality there is, and of course, as a result, it could be very low. World War I, World War II is a little more complex because many things had to come together to bring about this outcome. There's a great reduction in capital income because of all the dislocations that these wars cause in terms of capital flows and so on. There's massive government intervention in the private sector that devalues capital, reduces the profits that capitalists can gain. There's massive fiscal intervention to pay for the war effort. If you have to mobilize millions of people and build 100,000 tanks and that sort of thing, you need a lot of money. And that's why the US had top marginal income tax rates of 94% and that sort of thing, which wouldn't be politically feasible under any other circumstances. There's physical destruction, not in the US, but in many other countries, housing stock, factories, shipping, again, primarily owned by rich people. Many countries printed a lot of money to pay for the war, and they had hyperinflation that would wipe out investments. There is full employment because of conscription, war industry, so there's a redistribution of income from rich people to lower skilled workers. Any number of things happen, and on top there are these second order effects. There's a strong push for democracy. If you think of the 19th Amendment that was passed, ratified in 1920, directly as a result of World War I, many different things happening in other countries, a huge increase in trade union membership, that has an equalizing effect on the income distribution. The welfare state is really a result to a large extent of World War II, because for the first time the state has enough money to pay for these generous programs. There's the political will to do it. There's people's expectation that something will actually be done for them. It's a mobilized population used to fighting and being organized in a certain way that has a real effect on attitudes and political
You're talking about
outcomes.
1950s America here.
1950s America,
I'm always
Europe,
amazed that
Japan,
conservatives look back fondly on the 1950s when progressive upper tax rate was still 90%.
It was still 90%. That's the amazing thing. It was maintained at almost at war levels for several decades. And this only really ends, and not just in the US, also in other countries, with the great liberalization in the 80s and the following decades.
Another one of my favorite quotes from your book is from Justice Louis Brandeis. We can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And then you follow up saying, well, apparently you can, because that's what we have.
It depends on how you define democracy. Right?
Yeah.
Formal democracy, that it's certainly not an obstacle to the kind of concentration trends we see today.
Why? What do you mean?
Because there are many different types of democracy. Needless to say, especially it seems that two-party systems like we have or Great Britain, they seem to be somehow more sensitive to concentration of income and wealth because they're more likely to produce gridlock or polarization, which is not positively related to egalitarian outcomes. You have different outcomes in continental Europe. There are plenty of democracies in developing countries where it's easy for certain special interest groups to capture the system and make sure things work out a certain way. And again, that to some extent, of course,
You mean by
the US
influencing
too.
elections and who gets into power?
Yeah, you can do this more openly. You can do it in a more subtle way, like with campaign finance in this country. There are so many different ways in which democracies can be, nudged in a direction that really does not present a major obstacle to concentration of income and wealth.
We always hear about the Koch brothers influencing elections here, but of course the Democrats have their billionaires. The tech billionaires tend to lean left. So, is there any hope that at least it's balanced? Each has their billionaires? Or would it be better if we just didn't have the money?
Well, that may well be, but then it just reinforces polarization. And polarization can be shown, if you do the right regression analysis, can be shown to be correlated in a very bad way with inequality, among other things.
Now, in the 2016 campaign, Bernie got quite a following, and almost made it to the final election. And he was proposing something like a democratic re-establishing the system to be more equal. Could it work that way if he had his way, something like that?
You sort of really wonder, because he could have gotten elected supposedly on that platform, but then the problem would have been to actually pass legislation that would honor those pretty radical pledges, and then he would have had any number of even Democratic congressmen saying, well, I have a pretty marginal district. If I do all these things, I'm not going to be here anymore 2 years from now.
Right.
So there are realities it's not just Republicans, there are realities on the ground that would have constrained it. Same with Jeremy Corbyn, who apparently, if a few thousand people had voted differently, might now be the next prime minister, but he would run into the exact same problem. So maybe it has now become possible to be elected or become electable on these platforms, and that's interesting in and of itself, but actual implementation might turn out to be much harder.
You mean for centrist Democrats or slightly left-leaning Democrats, but not progressives, would not go along with those extreme equalizing programs?
Well, they certainly did. Again, a couple of generations ago, because everybody was doing it, but that was a very different environment.
Right. What was the Gini index for America, say, in the 50s and 60s?
It's considerably, the best metric is actually, and that's the one Piketty alerted us to, that in 1929, the highest earning 1% of American households made 20% of all income. And after the war, it was 10%. So their share halved. And it all happened during the Great Depression, and especially World War II. And now we're back to 20%, right? So it's like a V-shaped curve.
Right. And again, so why does it matter? So just to come at it a slightly different way. Let's say I own 1,000 shares of Apple stock, and it goes up $10 in a day, which sometimes it does. And so so now I've made $10,000. But Warren Buffett has 100,000 shares of Apple, and now he's made $1 million. And neither of us did anything. We just sit there and log on to see how we're doing. It doesn't feel like labor. It feels like I'm cheating a little bit, but that's the system we have. And so I think what happened after the '08 meltdown, and particularly after the Wall Street traders took their bonuses anyway, it kind of felt like, well, what are they really doing? They're just kind of moving digits around on computer screens, and then they take their 1% cut of managing these funds, and the billionaire, the billions still pile up, but they're not really producing. Like one of my best friends he made his fortune in chocolate chip cookies. He owned the Great American Chocolate Chip Cookie Company, and he eventually sold it for tens of millions of dollars. And it just seems like a nice thing to do. I'm making chocolate chip cookies. Everybody likes them, and he franchised his stores, and that feels so different than, say, financial industries. Or maybe landowners who, although seems like there's more labor in owning land because you have to maintain the property.
Well, it may be that we are focusing too much on wealth and the financial sector. So for instance, if you look at income inequality, which in a way affects us more directly, right? As you correctly say, if I have this many shares and the other guy has 1,000,000 times as many shares, it doesn't really affect our lives all that much, right? What does affect us is distribution of income. And if you have a situation, let's say over the last generation in the US, where the economy has grown in most years, and income concentration has risen the way I just described, the net result is there's a very large share of the population that don't enjoy any net increase in their incomes. And all the additional economic growth is really siphoned off by the people at the very top. And that does, I mean, that has a real result, because you can say, well, why do I not participate in this process? I work hard. I may even have more than one job now. You have 2 adults in the household working ever harder, which is well documented. And yet I'm like the Red Queen, right? I'm running just to stay in place. And the people in the top 1 or however many percent, they get more and more income over time, and I don't. So you see the scissors opening up. And that has a real effect on people's lives and also their perception of whether things are going in the right direction.
It's like when Romney's finances came out that he was only paying 15%. Well, he was paying capital gains tax. Most of his income came from just investments that he didn't actually have to go to a job. I mean, it feels so different from just I'm logging in to see how my investments are doing this morning, and now I'm going to spend the rest of the day at the beach, versus I got to go work at an office for 8 hours.
Yeah, so it's a matter of perception too. Yeah.
But that does feel psychologically like this just doesn't seem quite right. But that is the system.
Of course, it has always been the system, right? I think it's just, as you said, over the last 10 years, people have become more alert to it because of the financial crisis. Because for the first time, people realized, wait, there have been these trends out there that hadn't been as well known before. Because it wasn't just people who started paying attention, it was also economists. Not that economists aren't people, but special kind of people. And they didn't pay a huge amount of attention before, I think it's fair to say, to inequality per se. And now all of a sudden, this is a hot topic. And we have all these statistics that weren't really available in quite the same way before. And now it's easy for people to look at this and say, well, wait a minute, why have things been trending in this direction now for several decades? What's going on? Why is this wrong? What can be done about this?
Do you know this research by Paul Piff at UC Berkeley on the psychology of like income differences and how when you're all of a sudden given some money, you start acting differently. This is the guy that did the faux Monopoly game. So he sets up with subjects, we're going to play Monopoly. And some of the subjects are given 1 die to roll, and the others are given 2 die. And some start with like $1,000, and some start with $500. And some you get $200 when you pass go, and others only get $100 when you pass go. And some even got the Rolls Royce little thing instead of the old shoe. And so then he started, you can read about this, it records how the perceptions changed in this sort of just world psychology. It's like, well, I really deserve the double roll, and I really should have the rolls. And when I pass go, and everybody knows that the system is rigged, but it isn't long before the beneficiaries of the rigging start to feel like, well, this really is the way it should be. And then the other research that they did was monitoring intersections at UC Berkeley downtown Berkeley, noting the kinds of cars that would stop when somebody stepped into the sidewalk, into the crosswalk. And by law, you have to stop if somebody steps into the crosswalk. And so people that were like in Lexus and expensive BMWs or whatever, expensive cars, were far less likely to stop. They would just gun it and go around them or whatever. And so this was a proxy for, wealthier people were less likely to obey the law. And now they didn't stop them and say, hey, how come you didn't stop? So we don't know what they were thinking. But the assumption is that having so much more money than somebody else makes you, less thoughtful, less law-abiding, or more likely to want to take advantage of the system. And if you have any thoughts on that, I just thought that was, this is an argument for why, not just we want to keep the masses from rising up and torturing the society, but that it really does change people's psychology.
Yeah, and it might change the psychology on both sides, right? Because what is the effect on people who do have less? How do they respond to being confronted with the situation? Do we go back to a situation where people internalize this and say maybe that's the way it should be? Or does it lead to some kind of violent breakdown? And that's a question that always comes up, saying, well, you say there are these horsemen of the apocalypse, and in the past they brought down income and wealth inequality. Well, doesn't rising inequality today mean we are moving in that direction again? Isn't there going to be a civil war, a violent breakdown of war, something to bring about a new reset? Isn't there some kind of almost automatic feature, some reset button built into the whole process? And it seems the answer is really, no, not so much, right? You go back into the past, look at the French Revolution, right? France was extremely unequal 200 years ago. Versailles, Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, all these stories, right? So of course they had a revolution. Well, all the other countries around France and Europe, just as unequal, nothing happened, right? So inequality is really, really resilient. China wasn't terribly unequal when Mao came along. So there's no direct relationship, in a way, between these violent breakdowns and conditions of inequality that precede them. And of course, you have to bear in mind, modern states are much more resilient than they used to be. They are much more deeply entrenched in society. They shape people's lives in ways they just didn't in the past. And they have really good surveillance, as we keep finding out. So that's a pretty promising mix, in the sense of, if you desire stability, that's what we are likely to get, at least in developing countries.
In his review of your book in the Wall Street Journal, the economist Gregory Clark, who we hosted at one of our earlier lectures, in academic economics, as in electoral politics, inequality has become a topic of preeminent importance. Yet economics has no accepted theory of inequality, no scientific understanding of the mechanisms and processes that create it. And so really what your work is doing is sort of drawing the historical correlations between things that happen in inequality. But we still don't really know the underlying mechanism behind it.
I think so, yeah. And of course, Greg said, why doesn't this book deliver this unifying theory? I mean, if I was an economist, I played a ball back to the econ profession, but it's true. And I think that's a step in the right direction, because if you are able, as I think I can do, to document long-term patterns over a really long time around the globe, that's something that would need to be taken into account in developing something like a general theory of inequality. And that's something where I think the lack of economists up to quite recently really made a difference, that there hasn't been more work done in this
Because
direction.
they're focused on growth. We want a 3% growth economy. Could you have a
and even development, poverty, right? I mean, I don't mean to be unfair to economists. There's strong interest in that, but not so much in the distribution as such.
Yeah. Well, George Will made that point in his review. Just a couple of points that are of interest. In 2013, America's top 1% of earners paid 25% of all federal taxes. So isn't it okay that we have these billionaires? They pay so much more money in taxes. So Bill Gates pays, $100 million more in taxes than I do, but he doesn't get $100 million more in benefits. So doesn't that equalize the sort of the payment we make for having these inequalities?
Well, it does if you look at the percentages. If you actually price it out in dollars, you could say, Bill Gates pays this much in taxes and keeps that much in money, and I did this. So it very much depends on whether you look at proportions or actual amounts.
Right. I mentioned, I think when Sam Walton died, all of a sudden the number of billionaires went up by, all of his kids became billionaires. It's like the top 10 of the Fortune 500. So.
But actually, I want to say something about Bill Gates, because Bill Gates is really amazing. He has given away so much of his money, like billions and billions and billions of dollars, and he keeps getting richer.
Yes, that's
It seems he can't give his money away fast enough in order to stem this process, even though he doesn't even seem to particularly desire this outcome. It just seems to be happening. And that really shows what the system is like right now.
I just want to know how I can get in on that investment tools that he uses. I mean, whatever he's doing, obviously it works. And that's kind of the conservative argument for private charity versus taking care of the poor through government and taxes. This has always been kind of a tension between the right and the left on, we have a moral obligation to help those that are in need. So what's the best way to do that? Now, interestingly, the libertarian Charles Murray actually, he supports a basic minimum income as just a way of getting people up into a basic level of living such that they then to start feel responsible and more autonomous, they have more power, and then that'll kind of jumpstart the system.
There's only experiments underway, especially in Europe right now, trying this actually out and see how it works in practice. And it seems to work reasonably well. To what extent you can then export it to different types of societies like the US is an open question, but it's certainly something worth investigating. And that's a hot topic right now.
Yeah. And then the other thing, psychologically, why do you need so much more money? I mean, all the studies show that once you're above, I guess currently about 50 or 60,000 a year, making double that doesn't increase your happiness or your self-satisfaction or however they measure those. They're all self-report data. Just how happy are you on a 1 to 10 scale, and they have these different measures across different nations. And the happiest people on the planet, at least in the Western world, are the Northern European countries that have fairly high tax rates, but they have a tight social safety net, universal health care. There's very, very little homeless, and so on. And so maybe there's something there in terms of what governments can do to equalize things that are not part of the Four Horsemen, because we don't want those.
But you could also, you can invert the argument of saying, well, if you're really poor and you get a little more money, your life is going to be significantly better. It will feel much better. If you make another billion, if you're at the very top, it's going to make no difference to you whatsoever. So the rich don't really benefit all that much from inequality, so maybe we shouldn't worry too much about it, right? Because the utility, economists would say, is actually much lower than for someone who is poor, and that's why we should focus on poverty alleviation and not worry about great inequality, because the people at the very top don't really get that much out of it anyway in terms of how they experience it.
Yeah. I had a funny quote here from, let's see, it was, what the definition of a rich person is, H.L. Mencken's quote, "A wealthy man is one who earns $100 a year more than his wife's sister's husband." So even if we ended poverty, by definition, the UN defines it as less than $2.50 a day for regular poverty and less than $1.25 a day for extreme poverty. Even if you're making $3 a day, you're not out of poverty really. But let's say it was $10 a day or whatever it is, so you're not really. But as long as you have these wealthy 10% or whatever, 1%ers, it's still going to feel worse.
That's actually a very good point, because then the question is, how much do we actually, like your example is a very good one, because you can relate to that relative, right? It's difficult for me to imagine what it's like to be Bill Gates or an equivalent figure, and I might meet him at Stanford, I guess, but I would not in ordinary circumstances meet such a person. And so, in a way, perversely, you could say that the increasing segregation we see in the US in terms of where people live, where they go to school, whom they marry, that sort of thing, will actually mean they no longer meet people who are, let's say, significantly poorer or significantly richer than they are, because everything, that's again the Charles Murray argument, and others have validated that, that we're sort of growing apart in many ways. So our reference point should also shift as a result of this. So that should actually make us more tolerant, in a way, of overall inequality, but it doesn't really seem to be the case.
Right. You mentioned assortative mating in your book. Assortative mating is a sort of an evolutionary term where likes mate with likes. So Harvard people marry Harvard people because that's where you meet people when you're at that age. And they, by definition, are going to have a higher education and make more money. I forget what the figure was, but you had that, having a college education versus not was almost a 50% difference in life earnings and annual income. So right there, you're going to get income inequality just by dint of where people go to school and what they do with their lives that have nothing to do with graft and greed and corruption.
And that's sort of the underside of what we call meritocracy, right? You can put a positive spin on this and say, well, in the past, people would just inherit their parents' money, and that's just not really fair. And now they have to go to school and get credential and work hard for a living, and that's meritocratic. But at the same time, who is going to be in a position to enter these elite schools and enjoy all these advantages? It's going to be not exclusively, but predominantly people from an advantaged background. And so there's a new way of the system to perpetuate itself. It's no longer directly, I get my parents' money and I'm set up for life and nothing ever changes. It's I have to jump through all these hoops, but I'm better equipped to jump through all these hoops because of socioeconomic differences in the background.
Yeah, Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, he talks about these two zip codes and this cognitive elite the people that go to Harvard and Yale and so on are now living behind gated communities and they can afford it. And that just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the division between those who don't even go to college gets wider and wider, thus America's sort of coming apart in these cognitive elites.
You can imagine a spectrum where on one end of the spectrum you have Brazil, nothing against Brazil, but where the rich really do live in fortified compounds and fly around in helicopters because they're worried about getting kidnapped for ransom and that sort of thing. At the other end you would have, say, Denmark or some really egalitarian system where you have more integrated neighborhoods, mass schooling that isn't as stratified as our education system. And the US would be somewhere in between, right? And it does actually make a difference. So it depends on what part of the world you're looking at.
Do you know this book, Trekonomics? It's based on this idea of Star Trek economics. It's an actual technical term of post-scarcity economics. That is, let's say the 23rd century, everyone has everything they need. You just go to the replicator and say, Earl Grey hot, and boom, out comes the tea and the mug, and everything you need. And that it's sort of one of these Ray Kurzweil singularity type growth curves, like the Moore's law applied to economics. That eventually everyone will make the equivalent of, say, $100,000 in 2015 dollars, 2017 dollars, something like that. But I'm still not convinced this would make people happy, because they just think, yeah, but I don't have $1 billion. I only have 100,000. And even if you had everything you need, I have all the, you just order your meals out of the replicator, you order your car, like 3D printers. You can order, so it just gets cheaper and cheaper. Is that a solution?
Well, the question is, famously there's an article called "Who Owns the Robots?" Right? Someone's going to own the replicators and make them.
Oh,
it
yes,
has to
okay,
invest
right.
in keeping them going and so on. And they can't be totally free, because otherwise there's no incentive in maintaining the replicators unless they replicate themselves, and then we are enslaved by robots, which wouldn't be a very good outcome either. So that's not
Right.
perhaps. Marx already thought, we'll have true communism when all this stuff is just going to be produced by a superior productive system, and then we can all do whatever we decide. Everybody is happy. It hasn't really happened, apparently.
Everybody can be a literary critic at night, yeah.
And it seems, in the broadest possible term, that the hegemonic system we have of capitalism just is not going to lead to that particular outcome. It's just not very plausible.
Right, politically.
In any event, it's not. It sort of would violate the logic of capitalism.
Remember when President Obama made that comment about, you didn't build that. I think is what he said, and that you could hear the heads exploding over on Fox News. But if you actually talk to people that believe that, sort of progressives and so on, and try to understand where they're coming from, there's a lot of freebies that corporations get. Free roads. They can, free roads has made the automobile industry, the tire industry, and so on. They didn't have to pay for that, and you can dump your pollution into the air, or the rivers. So now we have more and more laws about that. But the argument is that if we really price products for all of their expenses, not just what it costs to make them, but the effects on all of us, these externalities as they're called, then you wouldn't have to work on equalizing things. Things would be more equal in terms of the prices are set at their proper value, and therefore you couldn't make that much money.
It would be a complicated tech, even more complicated than
yes,
what
I don't know how. Well, it'd be difficult to calculate, but it is calculated now with like carbon credits. So you can pour so much CO2 gas into the atmosphere, and then when you reach your level, if you want to do more, you have to buy credits from some other company that's below there. So we have, in a way, figured out a way to tax it or price it in that sense.
Well, the other thing is, that's something we haven't even mentioned yet. There are more than 200 countries in the world today, and we are more globalized than at any point in history. And that's overall also not something that would help constrain inequality. We had a first push in that direction in the late 19th, early 20th century with more or less free trade worldwide. That was a phase of rising inequality. And then from the World War I, actually into the 70s, globalization was much more limited than it is now. And that coincided with falling or pretty low inequality. And there are tons of studies showing there is a meaningful relationship between freedom of movement of capital, investment, labor, the products of labor, and so on, across a workforce of now billions of people worldwide. And that makes it very difficult for any one government to say, let's do whatever the recipes are. And there are entire books full of recipes about how to stem the tide of rising inequality. Well, that's all great, but how do you actually implement this? If you do it only in one place, you're going to be in trouble. How are you going to establish transnational consensus for more invasive measures? That's just not very likely to materialize.
Is it, I've always liked the idea of globalization. Break down those political borders, people become more tolerant when they travel and interact with people different from them. In principle, it sounds good, but it's become a kind of a bugaboo for, you would think people on the left would like that idea because of its sort of universal nature, but it's really attacked mostly by people on the left. Maybe it's because big corporations go to these third world nations and exploit the people. Maybe that's the...
Well, I don't necessarily exploit the people. I mean, globalization has done wonders for poverty alleviation. I mean, China is the most extreme example, right? China was really poor and really equal 40 years ago, and now it's super unequal and much wealthier than it was before. If you ask the average Chinese person, what would you rather have? I guess they would say, well, I may not like the fact that there are all these billionaires out there, but I like my new middle class life. I don't want to go back to the village and wear, the Mao outfit and all these various things. So, I mean, there is a trade-off in that sense, and a very real one, and we can't just say inequality is always bad. This is really a side effect of something that has benefited hundreds of millions of people just in that one case.
So even when, say, Apple has all their iPhones and iPads built at, what was it, Fox, what's it called, Fox?
Taiwan.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's described in our media as this, horrific place of this, exploitation, but there's people lined up to get those jobs.
Yeah, because I guess Apple pays high enough incomes to be really competitive in the local economy.
But I guess the sense is that, but they're poorer than Americans' lowest workers would be paid for something like that.
That's something we are not responsible for. I mean, this happened 200 years ago when Northwestern Europe industrialized first, and there were all kinds of colonial structures in place to perpetuate this advantage. That's the world we live in today, and so that's not something that can be fixed overnight. And in fact, globalization does go a long way in gradually reducing this gap between developed and developing countries.
Right. Well, I want to watch our time here and leave plenty of time for discussion with the audience because I know people have opinions on this. So thank you, Walter, for such an interesting conversation. And thank you. Yep. Appreciate that. Very good. So the discussion was fun. Yes.